The ending of Stranger Things was never meant to surprise you. It was meant to make sense. From the very first episode, the creators were not asking how big this story could get, but how it should end. And that distinction matters, because Season 5 is not designed as a twist ending, it is designed as a resolution. When the Duffers talked about finishing this story, they consistently used the same language: emotional closure, character-driven, bittersweet but earned. That tells us something important right away. The final moments of Stranger Things will not be about defeating a monster in a final boss fight. They will be about understanding what the monster always was. To see how the story ends, we have to stop looking at Vecna as the threat and start looking at the system that created him. Because Vecna is not the Upside Down. Vecna is a product of it. And once you understand that, the entire trajectory of Season 5 becomes much clearer. One of the biggest mistakes people make when predicting the ending is assuming the story ends the same way it escalated. Bigger monsters, bigger battles, bigger sacrifices. But Stranger Things has never actually worked like that. Every season escalates the danger while quietly narrowing the solution. In Season 1, the solution was escape. In Season 2, it was containment. In Season 3, it was disruption. In Season 4, it was exposure. Season 5 is about resolution. And resolution does not come from power, it comes from structure. Vecna represents a closed-loop system built on trauma. His power grows when pain is unresolved, when fear is suppressed, when identity is fractured. This is not metaphorical language. It is how the show has literally portrayed psychic power since the beginning. Every time Eleven loses control, her power spikes. And every time she regains her sense of self, her power stabilizes. That mirrors real neurological patterns, where emotional regulation directly affects cognitive output. Heightened stress increases raw output, but destroys precision. Calm reduces intensity, but restores control. Season 5 is not asking whether Eleven can be stronger than Vecna. It is asking whether she can be healthier than him. That is a critical difference. Vecna wins through amplification. Eleven wins through integration. Which brings us to the Upside Down itself. Because the Upside Down is not just an alternate dimension, it is a preserved psychological state. We know this because time inside it is frozen on the day Will disappeared. Not the day the gate opened, not the day Vecna transformed, the day a child was taken and left in survival mode. In trauma research, this is called fixation, when the mind locks onto a moment and builds an internal environment around it. The Upside Down behaves exactly like that. It mirrors Hawkins but strips it of warmth. It preserves structures but removes safety. It remembers but cannot grow. Vecna did not create this place from nothing. He learned how to control it. And control is the operative word. The hive mind is not just a creature network, it is a feedback loop. Vecna feeds on emotional isolation and then reinforces it. Every victim he chooses is already alone, already fractured, already carrying unresolved pain. That is not coincidence. It is system compatibility. This is why simply killing Vecna cannot end the story. Even if Vecna dies, the system that rewards trauma would still exist. The Upside Down would still be frozen, still hungry, still waiting for a new focal point. The ending of Stranger Things, therefore, has to do something much harder. It has to let the system complete its cycle. And that is where Will Byers becomes essential. Will is not important because he is powerful. He is important because he was first. He is the original point of contact, the moment the Upside Down anchored itself to Hawkins. And unlike Vecna, Will did not embrace the isolation. He endured it. He came back carrying the imprint of that place, but refused to become it. This is why his connection never fully went away. The show has repeatedly shown that emotional openness weakens Vecna's control. Music breaks possession. Memory disrupts psychic dominance. Human connection destabilizes the hive. Will embodies all three. He feels deeply, he remembers clearly, and he never fully severed his attachment to the people who saved him. Season 5 will not turn Will into a weapon. It will turn him into a key, because the only way to end a trauma loop is to resolve the originating moment. Not overwrite it, not destroy it, resolve it. This is where Max's condition becomes critical. Max is alive but inaccessible, conscious but unreachable. Her mind exists in a liminal state, similar to sensory deprivation environments studied in neurology. When external input is removed, the brain begins reconstructing reality internally. That space is unpredictable, but also unstable. Vecna cannot fully control Max because control requires narrative coherence. Max has none. Her presence represents a crack in the system, a place where the loop cannot complete. When 11 searches for Max and finds nothing, that is not failure. That is foreshadowing. It tells us the final confrontation will not take place in a physical space or even a psychic battlefield. It will take place at the point where memory, identity, and choice intersect. This is why Season 5 will slow down rather than escalate endlessly. The story has reached its maximum external threat. What remains is internal resolution, and that resolution comes with cost, but not the kind most people expect. Stranger Things has never treated death as a reward or punishment. It treats it as consequence. If someone is lost in the final season, it will not be to shock the audience.
It will be because the story requires a door to close permanently. More likely, however, is a sacrifice of access rather than life, a permanent separation between worlds, a loss of power, a goodbye to the part of childhood that allowed these doors to open in the first place. The final moments of Stranger Things will not show Hawkins restored overnight. They will show Hawkins changed, scarred, quiet, healing, because that is how trauma actually resolves, not by erasing the damage, but by integrating it into a life that continues anyway. The final image will not be 11 standing victorious. It will be the group existing with the constant pull of crisis. Older, grounded, no longer defined by survival. And the Upside Down will not be destroyed. It will be finished. Its story told. Its loop closed. Its purpose exhausted. That is how Stranger Things ends. Not with noise, but with understanding.
To understand how Season 5 resolves its story, we need to look closely at how Stranger Things treats power. Power in this universe has always come with a biological and psychological cost. Eleven's nosebleeds are not just visual flare, they represent neurological overload. Real studies on extreme cognitive strain show similar symptoms: vascular pressure, sensory bleed, motor instability. The show uses these cues deliberately to communicate limits. Vecna, on the other hand, shows almost no physical degradation, and that is because he has externalized the cost of his power. He feeds the system with the pain of others rather than bearing it himself. That difference defines the ending. Season 5 is not about overpowering Vecna, it is about removing his ability to offload damage. Once the system stops absorbing trauma for him, Vecna collapses under the weight of what he has been avoiding since childhood. This reframes his origin story in a critical way. Henry Creel was not born evil, he was born hypersensitive. The show has repeatedly linked heightened perception with instability. Sounds too loud, emotions too intense, patterns impossible to ignore. Without guidance or grounding, that sensitivity turned inward, and then outward. When Henry was placed into institutional isolation, it completed the loop. The system taught him that separation equals safety, control equals peace. The Upside Down is the architectural expression of that belief. Season 5 dismantles it by proving the belief wrong, which is why the group matters more than ever. Stranger Things has never been about a single hero. It has always been about distributed resilience. Each character represents a stabilizing force in the system. Mike anchors identity. Dustin represents logic and curiosity. Lucas embodies loyalty under pressure. Max shows the cost of isolation. Will represents survival without surrender. And 11 is the convergence point. She is not the strongest because of her power. She is the strongest because of her connections. The final season reinforces this by removing the option of solitary victory. Every attempt to face Vecna alone fails, not because the characters are weak, but because the system punishes isolation. This is consistent with real-world trauma recovery models. Healing accelerates when individuals are embedded in stable social networks. Stranger Things mirrors this exactly. That is why music works against Vecna. Music activates autobiographical memory and emotional regulation. That is documented neurological behavior. It is not magical logic. It is narrative science. The final confrontation will therefore not be loud or chaotic. It will be structured. It will involve synchronization. Multiple characters acting in parallel to destabilize the loop. Will's connection allows access. Max's liminal state creates instability. 11 provides regulation.
The others ground the process emotionally. This is how the Upside Down is neutralized, not destroyed, but released. The gate does not slam shut, it dissolves, because gates in this story are not doors, they are dependencies.
Once the emotional dependency collapses, the physical breach follows. That collective suppression is part of why the Upside Down found purchase there in the first place. Season 5 addresses this subtly, through small scenes rather than speeches. Parents listening, authorities stepping back, people finally believing what their children say. These moments matter because they show systemic correction. The show does not suggest the world becomes perfect, it suggests it becomes responsive. That distinction defines the tone of the ending. Bittersweet does not mean tragic, it means honest. Childhood ends not because innocence is destroyed, but because responsibility arrives. The characters cannot go back to who they were before, but they no longer need to keep fighting either. The cost of saving Hawkins is not death, it is transition. Growing up, letting go of the fantasy that power solves pain. The final sacrifice, therefore, is not a person, it is access. 11 does not lose her humanity, she loses her necessity. She no longer has to bleed to keep the world safe, and that is the quiet victory of the story. Stranger Things ends by removing the need for Stranger Things. The supernatural recedes not because it was defeated, but because it was understood. And understanding breaks the loop forever.
As Season 5 moves towards its final act, the story begins to narrow its focus even further. The scale of the threat remains massive, but the lens becomes intimate. Stranger Things has always done this in its endings. The world feels like it is ending, while the camera stays with the people. That choice is intentional, because the resolution is not about saving reality in the abstract. It is about deciding what kind of reality is worth returning to. By this point, Hawkins is no longer just a setting, it is evidence. Evidence of what happens when fear is ignored and pain is buried. The Upside Down did not choose Hawkins at random. It chose a place where silence already existed, where children were expected to endure rather than explain. Season 5 quietly corrects this by giving its characters something they never had before: agency without crisis. Choices not driven by emergency, but by values. This is most clearly seen in 11. For the first time, she is not reacting, she is deciding. That distinction changes everything. Earlier seasons framed her power as a response to threat. Now her power is contextual, used carefully, conservatively, almost reluctantly. This reflects a real psychological shift. Trauma survivors often move from hypervigilance to selective engagement as healing progresses. Season 5 mirrors this arc with precision. 11 does not shut down, she calibrates. And calibration is what ultimately dismantles Vecna. Vecna cannot adapt to a system that no longer amplifies fear. His strength depends on escalation, on pushing others into extremes. When that escalation stops, he has nowhere to grow. This is why his final moments are not explosive, they are constrictive. The system he built turns inward, not as punishment, but as inevitability. Without external trauma to feed on, Vecna is forced to experience his own unfiltered. The same isolation, the same sensory overload, the same emotional flood he spent his life projecting outward. The show does not linger on this for spectacle. It treats it as closure, a loop finally closing. Will's role in this moment is not to fight, but to witness. That matters because survival without acknowledgement perpetuates trauma. Will acknowledging what happened completes the story the Upside Down started. This is also why Mike remains central until the end. Mike's role has never been about strategy or strength. It has been about recognition, seeing people when they are afraid of being seen. That recognition stabilizes 11 when the system tries to fracture her. It grounds the process long enough for it to finish. Max's return does not arrive as a sudden awakening. It arrives gradually, fragmented, disoriented, which aligns with real recovery patterns from severe neurological trauma. Memory does not snap back into place. It rebuilds, slowly, imperfectly. The show respects this by allowing Max to change. She does not return as she was. None of them do. And that is the point. The ending of Stranger Things does not promise restoration. It promises continuity. Life after trauma is not a reset, it is a continuation with context. Hawkins reflects this in its final scenes. Buildings remain damaged, familiar places feel different, but people occupy them differently, with attention, with care. The government presence recedes not because it solved the problem, but because control is no longer required. The crisis framework dissolves. What remains is responsibility. The final goodbye is not framed as an ending to friendship. It is framed as an expansion of it. Paths diverge, distance grows, but the bond is no longer dependent on shared danger. That is the quiet maturity of the ending. Stranger Things does not freeze its characters in nostalgia. It lets them move forward. The supernatural closes because it no longer has narrative fuel. Childhood fear has been named, processed, integrated, and without that fuel, the door cannot stay open. The final moments do not ask the audience to mourn what was lost. They ask the audience to recognize what was gained: understanding, connection, and the ability to continue without needing a monster to define the moment. That is how the story prepares to end, by teaching its characters how to live without it.
The final act of Stranger Things does something rare for a story of this scale. It allows silence to matter. After seasons of constant escalation, the ending intentionally removes noise. No overlapping crises, no last-minute reversals, just consequence unfolding at a human pace. This is how the show signals completion. The Upside Down does not collapse in a spectacular explosion. It recedes as its purpose dissolves. Without unresolved fear to mirror it, it cannot sustain form. This aligns with how closed psychological systems behave when stressors are removed. They do not shatter, they decay. Slowly, quietly, almost anticlimactically. And that is why the final victory feels strange at first. There is no triumphant celebration, no clear line between before and after, because real endings rarely offer that clarity. Eleven's final moment is not framed as a farewell to power. It is framed as a return to choice. For the first time, she exists without being needed as a solution. That absence of necessity is freedom. The show has been building toward this from the beginning. A child created to fix problems, finally allowed to live without being one. Will's arc completes not with confrontation, but with integration. He no longer senses the Upside Down because there is nothing left to sense. The echo fades, and with it the constant reminder of survival. What remains is memory, not intrusive, not controlling, just present. This is critical because memory without fear is the definition of healing. Max's recovery continues beyond the final scene, intentionally unfinished, because recovery is not a plot device, it is a process. The show refuses to compress it into a moment of convenience. Instead, it leaves space, trusting the audience to understand that not all progress is visible immediately. The group does not promise to stay together forever. They promise to stay connected. That distinction reflects growth. Childhood friendships survive by proximity. Adult ones survive by intention. Stranger Things chooses the latter. Hawkins itself becomes quieter, not fixed, but no longer ignored. The final image echoes the first season without copying it, a familiar place, now inhabited without fear. The absence of threat becomes the presence of peace, and that is the true ending, not the defeat of evil, but the removal of the conditions that allowed it to exist. Stranger Things ends by closing the loop it opened in episode 1. A child disappears, a community fractures. Fear creates a world beneath the world, and it ends when that fear is finally understood and released. No reset, no erasure, just continuation. Older, wiser, grounded. The story does not ask the audience to keep looking backward. It invites them to move forward with the characters, carrying what mattered and leaving the rest behind. That is how Stranger Things ends.